December 16th, 1944. Bastogne, Belgium. Colonel David Roberts stood in the frozen command post, studying a map that showed his 101st Airborne Division completely surrounded. 7 German divisions, over 45,000 troops, had encircled the town. His own force, 18,000 men low on ammunition, freezing in the Ardennes winter, cut off from all supply lines. A German officer had just delivered an ultimatum under a white flag: surrender within 2 hours or face total annihilation. Roberts' response would become one of the most famous single words in military history. But what the Germans didn't know, what even Roberts himself couldn't have predicted, was that the stand at Bastogne would not just stop the largest German offensive since 1940, it would fundamentally alter how modern armies understood defensive warfare. The mathematics seemed impossible. By every tactical calculation, Bastogne should have fallen in 48 hours. Instead, it held for 7 days against overwhelming odds, inflicting casualties at a ratio that defied every principle of siege warfare. The defenders would lose 2,500 men. The Germans would lose over 15,000 trying to take a single crossroads town. This is a story of how 18,000 surrounded paratroopers rewrote the rules of defensive combat, proving that determination combined with innovative tactics could overcome numerical superiority so absolute it seemed like a mathematical certainty of defeat. The strategic miscalculation. 3 months earlier, in September 1944, Adolf Hitler had assembled his generals at the Wolf's Lair to outline Operation Watch on the Rhine. His plan was audacious. Smash through the lightly held Ardennes forest, split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate peace. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Germany's most experienced commander, had called the plan militarily insane. The logistics alone required capturing intact fuel depots, as German tanks wouldn't have enough fuel to reach their objectives. Weather needed to be bad enough to ground Allied aircraft, but clear enough for rapid armored advance. And they needed to move so fast that American reserves couldn't react. Hitler dismissed these concerns. He had something the cautious von Rundstedt didn't appreciate: the element of complete surprise, and an attacking force of 410,000 men backed by 1,400 tanks and assault guns. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 16th, the artillery barrage began. 14-inch railway guns, howitzers, and mortars turned 85 miles of American front line into an inferno. At 5:30 a.m., German infantry and armor surged forward through the morning fog. The American 8th Corps, holding this quiet sector with just 4 divisions spread across 80 miles, shattered almost immediately. Green troops who'd never seen combat broke and ran. Entire battalions surrendered. By nightfall, German panzers had penetrated up to 8 miles into American lines. But there was a problem in the German plan. 7 roads converged at a small Belgian town called Bastogne. Every major route west ran through this crossroads. To sustain their offensive, the Germans needed Bastogne, not just captured, but captured quickly and intact. The race to Bastogne. December 17th, 1944. SAF headquarters, Versailles. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower looked at the situation map and saw what the Germans had missed. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not a disaster, he told his staff. There will be only cheerful faces at this table. His reasoning was tactical geometry. The deeper the Germans penetrated, the more exposed their flanks became. But first, he needed to deny them Bastogne. Eisenhower ordered the 101st Airborne Division and 10th Armored Division to move immediately. The 101st was resting in Mourmelon, France, after their disastrous operation in Holland. Many men were en passe in Paris. Equipment had been turned in for maintenance. They had no winter clothing, minimal ammunition, and most of their vehicles were deadline for repairs. At 20:30 hours on December 17th, the alert order came through. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division's artillery commander serving as acting division commander, gave his officers 2 hours to assemble the division. What happened next would be studied in military logistics courses for decades. In less than 24 hours, the 101st recalled men from across France, scrounged equipment from every depot within 50 miles, loaded 380 trucks, and moved over 100 miles to Bastogne. They arrived just hours before the German encirclement closed. The encirclement. December 20th, 1944. Bastogne perimeter. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. German forces had surrounded the town completely. The 101st, along with combat command via the 10th Armored Division, elements of the 9th Armored Division, and various artillery and support units, totaled approximately 18,000 men, holding a perimeter roughly 16 miles in circumference. Against them, the 2nd Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr Division, 26 Volksgrenadier Division, an element of 3 other divisions, over 45,000 troops with 300 tanks and assault guns. The supply situation was catastrophic. The division had arrived with minimal ammunition, perhaps 3 days of combat supplies at normal expenditure rates. Medical supplies were critically short. Food was running out. The men had no winter clothing beyond their standard uniforms, and temperatures were dropping to 0 degrees Fahrenheit at night. Worse, the weather that had grounded Allied aircraft and enabled the German attack showed no signs of clearing. The defenders were on their own, but McAuliffe had advantages the Germans didn't recognize. First, the 101st Airborne was an elite unit with extraordinary training. These men had jumped into Normandy on D-Day and fought through Holland. They knew how to operate in chaos. Second, Bastogne's road network worked both ways. While the Germans needed those roads to advance, the Americans could use them as kill zones. Every approach to the town was a natural defensive position. Third, McAuliffe had something no amount of German firepower could overcome. He had time. Every day Bastogne held was another day for Patton's Third Army to break through from the south. Nuts! December 22nd, 1944. 11:30 hours. 4 German officers approached the American lines under a white flag. Major Alvin Jones, commanding a company of the 327th Glider Infantry, met them blindfolded per protocol and brought them to his battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore. The German officers presented a formal surrender ultimatum, typed in English, to the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. The fortune of war is changing. This time the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. The message warned of total annihilation if the Americans refused, noting the German forces' superiority, and stating that one American unit had already surrendered the previous day. Moore sent the ultimatum up to division headquarters. McAuliffe read it, laughed, and said, "Ah, nuts." He started to write a formal military refusal, then stopped. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, his G3 operations officer, suggested, "That first remark of yours will be hard to beat." McAuliffe's official reply, delivered to the stunned German officers, read in its entirety. To the German commander, "Nuts." The American commander. When the German officers asked for clarification, Colonel Joseph Harper, who delivered the message, told them, "If you don't understand what nuts means, in plain English it is the same as go to hell. And I will tell you something else. If you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into the city." The message electrified American morale. When word spread to the perimeter, it also told the Germans something crucial. These Americans weren't going to break. The artillery solution. What made Bastogne's defense possible wasn't just courage. It was mathematics and innovation in fire support. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Sherburne commanded the artillery inside the perimeter. For battalions of 105mm howitzers and 1 battalion of 155mm guns. Against a normal siege, this would be inadequate, but Sherburne developed a revolutionary fire control system. He positioned all artillery battalions near the center of town, allowing them to fire in any direction. Then he created a unified fire control network, where any observer could call for fire from any battery. This meant he could mask the fire of all 48 howitzers and 12 heavy guns on a single target within minutes. The Germans learned this the hard way. On December 19th, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division attacked from the north with 2 regiments. Forward observers spotted them forming up at 2,000 yards. Within 90 seconds, all American artillery was firing at that single position. Over 1,200 rounds landed in under 4 minutes. The attack dissolved before it crossed the line of departure. The next day, German armor attempted to penetrate from the west. American artillery fired time delay fuses, creating airbursts that rained shrapnel down on exposed tank commanders. When the panzers buttoned up, American bazookas teams, now effectively invisible to the blind tanks, moved in for close-range kills. By December 21st, the Germans had realized frontal assault was suicide. They shifted to a siege approach, try and starve the defenders out. They didn't know about Patton's approach. Neither, in fact, did McAuliffe. The weather miracle. December 23rd, 1944. 9 o'clock hours. McAuliffe stood outside his headquarters and looked up at the sky. For the first time in a week, he could see blue. The weather that had grounded Allied aircraft was clearing, and American logistics had been working night and day to prepare for exactly this moment. At 9:47, the first C-47 transport appeared over Bastogne at 800 feet. Colored parachutes blossomed as bundles tumbled out, ammunition, medical supplies, food, and cold weather gear. By day's end, 241 aircraft had dropped 334 tons of supplies with 95% accuracy. But the real game changer wasn't supplies, it was the fighter bombers. P-47 Thunderbolts from the 19 Tactical Air Command began arriving in waves. German columns that had been moving freely for a week suddenly found themselves under attack from aircraft carrying 500-pound bombs, napalm, and 8.50 caliber machine guns. On December 23rd alone, American aircraft flew over 1,000 sorties in the Bastogne area. German unit after action reports describe continuous air attack, making movement suicidal. Tanks that had survived American artillery were destroyed from the air. Supply columns burned for miles. The siege was still on, but the balance had fundamentally shifted. Patton's race. December 22nd, 1944. 3rd Army Headquarters, Luxembourg. Lieutenant General George S. Patton had made a promise to Eisenhower that seemed impossible. He would disengage his entire 3rd Army from its offensive in the Saar, well at 90 degrees north, and attack the southern flank of the German penetration, all in 48 hours. Military doctrine said this was impossible. Moving an army required weeks of planning. Patton did it in 2 days, moving over 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles in one of the most impressive logistical feats of the war. His spearhead, the 4th Armored Division under Major General Hugh Gaffey, with Combat Command Reserve led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams leading the point. The attack jumped off at 6 o'clock on December 22nd. The Germans, focused entirely on Bastogne, barely had defenses facing south. American armor smashed through, covering 20 miles the first day. But then German reserves arrived. The 5th Parachute Division, the Führer Grenadier Brigade, and elements of 4 other divisions formed a defensive line. Patton's advance slowed to a crawl, half a mile per hour against fanatical resistance. Inside Bastogne, McAuliffe didn't know if Patton would arrive in time. German attacks were intensifying. Ammunition stocks were down to 10 rounds per gun. Medical supplies were critically low, with surgeons operating by candlelight in the town cellars. The final German assault. December 25th, 1944. Christmas Day. 3 o'clock hours. The Germans launched their strongest attack yet. A combined arms assault by 18 tanks and 2 infantry battalions from Panzer Lehr and the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, hitting the southwestern perimeter near the villages of Champs and Hemrel. They achieved initial surprise, penetrating 500 yards into American lines. But then they hit the 327th Glider Infantry and Team Cherry from the 10th Armored Division. What followed was close-quarters combat of almost unprecedented intensity. American bazookas stalked German tanks through burning buildings. Paratroopers climbed onto panzers and dropped grenades through hatches. Artillery fired at point-blank range, under 200 yards. Lieutenant Colonel Ray Allen, commanding 3rd Battalion, 327th Glider Infantry, called an artillery on his own position, stating, "Fire every gun we have on coordinates 5877. We're being overrun." Every American howitzer in range fired continuously for 12 minutes, dropping over 600 rounds around Allen's battalion. When the barrage lifted, the German attack had been destroyed. 18 tanks burned. Over 300 German dead lay in the snow. The defense had held, but barely. McAuliffe had no reserves left. Another major attack might break through. Contact, December 26, 1944, 16:45 hours. Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding a platoon of Sherman tanks from the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion, approached Bastogne from the south. For 6 days, his battalion had fought through 15 miles of the heaviest resistance he'd ever encountered. Now, ahead of him, he could see the town and American positions. Boggess' tank, Cobra King, accelerated toward the perimeter. American troops emerged from foxholes, initially ready to fire on what they thought was another German attack. Then they saw the white star on the tank's turret. At 16:50, Lieutenant Colonel Boggess radioed, "Come here. This is the 4th Armored." The siege was broken. The aftermath. When historians analyzed Bastogne, the numbers told a remarkable story. American forces engaged. 18,000 initially, rising to 22,000 as small reinforcements filtered through German lines. German forces engaged. 45,000 to 50,000 from 7 divisions. Duration of siege, 7 days completely surrounded. 11 days of combat total. American casualties, 2,500 killed, wounded, missing. German casualties, 15,000 plus killed, wounded, captured. Ammunition expenditure. American artillery fired over 100,000 rounds, an average of 2,000 rounds per gun. Supply by air, 1,446 tons delivered in 961 sorties. German armor destroyed. Over 100 tanks and assault gun confirmed. The defense of Bastogne delayed the German offensive by a full week at the critical junction of 7 roads. This delay allowed Allied forces to reinforce, contain the penetration, and ultimately defeat the offensive entirely. But the true significance went beyond tactical results. Bastogne demonstrated that modern defensive warfare, properly conducted with integrated combined arms, fire support, and determined infantry, could hold against overwhelming numerical superiority. The Germans had assumed that with a 2.5:1 numerical advantage and 3:1 armor superiority, Bastogne would fall in 48 hours. Instead, they broke themselves against a defense that inflicted casualties at a 6-to-1 ratio in favor of the defenders. The innovation factor. What made Bastogne possible wasn't just courage, though the paratroopers showed that in abundance. It was systematic innovation under pressure. McAuliffe's unified fire control system allowed artillery to mass fires in ways that multiplied effectiveness by a factor of 4. The perimeter defense relied on mobile reserves rather than linear trenches, allowing defenders to shift forces rapidly. Integration of armor and infantry at the platoon level created combined arms teams far more effective than either alone. Use of artillery in direct fire anti-tank roles when ammunition for anti-tank weapons ran low. Aggressive patrolling that kept Germans off balance and gathered intelligence. These innovations would become standard doctrine in the post-war U.S. Army, fundamentally changing how America approached defensive operations. Personal costs. Behind the statistics were individual stories of sacrifice that defined Bastogne's defense. Private First Class Kurt Gable, a medic with the 101st, worked for 7 days straight without sleep, treating over 200 wounded in a makeshift aid station in a town cellar. He died on December 25th when a German shell hit the cellar. His last words, according to witnesses, were instructions on how to treat a wounded soldier he'd been working on. Lieutenant Eric Wood, separated from his unit during the initial German breakthrough, refused to surrender. For a week, he conducted a one-man guerrilla war behind German lines, ambushing supply columns and killing dozens of German soldiers. He died in a final shootout with an entire German platoon on December 23rd. His body, found weeks later, was surrounded by 49 empty rifle cartridges and 23 German dead. These stories, multiplied thousands of times across all ranks and units, explain how 18,000 surrounded men held against 45,000 attackers. It wasn't just tactics or firepower. It was a determination of individuals to fight even when the situation seemed hopeless. McAuliffe's leadership. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe wasn't supposed to be commanding the 101st at Bastogne. He was a division artillery commander, filling in because Major General Maxwell Taylor was in Washington. Yet his leadership during the siege demonstrated principles that would be studied for decades. First, he maintained offensive spirit even in defense. McAuliffe ordered constant patrols, raids, and counterattacks. The Germans never felt they controlled the battlefield, even when they held numerical superiority. Second, he ensured every soldier understood the situation. McAuliffe circulated among the positions daily, explaining why Bastogne mattered and what they were accomplishing. Morale remained high even when supplies were critically short. Third, he never showed doubt. When staff officers suggested planning withdrawal routes, McAuliffe responded, "We're not going anywhere. Start planning how we're going to kill more Germans tomorrow." This leadership style, offensive-minded, communicative, and unshakably confident, became the model for American commanders in desperate situations. The German perspective. After the war, German commanders tried to explain why Bastogne had held when it shouldn't have. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding the XLVI Panzer Corps that surrounded Bastogne, wrote in his memoir, "We made a mistake of assuming Americans would behave logically. Logically, they should have surrendered. They had no chance. But these paratroopers didn't fight logically. They fought with emotion, determination, and a tactical flexibility we couldn't match." He noted that German doctrine emphasized overwhelming force applied at a single point to break enemy resistance. At Bastogne, overwhelming force accomplished nothing because the Americans refused to accept they were beaten. Major General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Division, was more blunt. "The Americans at Bastogne fought like we wished our soldiers would fight, with initiative, aggression, and absolute refusal to accept defeat. It was like fighting ourselves in 1940, except they had better artillery and air support." Strategic impact. Bastogne's defense didn't just delay the German offensive. It fundamentally changed the strategic situation in Western Europe. By holding the critical road junction, the 101st forced German armor to detour around Bastogne, adding 40 to 60 miles to their advance routes. This consumed fuel they couldn't replace, slowed their tempo, and allowed Allied forces to establish defensive positions. When Patton's relief force broke through, it didn't just save Bastogne. It created the southern shoulder of an Allied counteroffensive that would, over the next month, completely destroy the German forces that had penetrated into Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge cost Germany 100,000 casualties, 800 tanks, and effectively ended the Wehrmacht as an offensive force. Much of that strategic defeat stemmed directly from the week that Bastogne held. Recognition. The 101st Airborne Division received the Presidential Unit Citation for Bastogne, the highest unit award the United States can bestow. The citation read in part, "Without benefit prepared defenses, facing tremendous odds and with limited supplies and communications, the heroic combat team of the 101st Airborne Division contributed decisively to the ultimate defeat and destruction of the enemy." McAuliffe received the Distinguished Service Cross. His nuts response became one of the most famous messages in military history, taught at every military academy as an example of leadership communication that crystallizes a unit's fighting spirit. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the paratroopers themselves. Decades later, veterans of Bastogne would wear distinctive patches marking them as members of the Battered Bastards of Bastogne, a self-applied nickname that captured both their pride and their humor about the impossible thing they'd accomplished. Lasting lessons. Modern military analysis of Bastogne reveals principles that remain valid. Superior combined arms integration defeats numerical superiority. The Americans at Bastogne fought as a true combined arms team where infantry, armor, and artillery supported each other seamlessly. Defensive positions must be actively defended. McAuliffe's insistence on patrolling and counterattacking prevented Germans from ever establishing comfortable siege positions. Morale is a combat multiplier. The paratroopers' belief they would be relieved, maintained to McAuliffe's leadership, allowed them to endure conditions that should have broken unit cohesion. Artillery remains the king of battle. Sherburne's innovative fire control system, massing all guns on single targets, multiplied American firepower effectiveness beyond what the numbers suggested. Air superiority changes everything. Once weather cleared and American aircraft appeared, the entire dynamic of the siege shifted in hours. The final accounting. 7 days surrounded. 18,000 men against 45,000. 10 rounds of artillery ammunition per gun remaining when relief arrived. Temperatures below zero. No air support for the first 4 days. Medical supplies for perhaps 200 wounded when they were treating over 2,000. By every logical calculation, Bastogne should have fallen. That it didn't. That it held long enough to wreck German offensive plans and enable Allied counterattack demonstrates something that transcends tactical analysis. The defense of Bastogne proved that in warfare, human factors, leadership, morale, determination, innovation under pressure, can overcome material disadvantages that seem mathematically insurmountable. Colonel Roberts' nuts wasn't just defiance. It was a declaration that Americans would not be defeated by numbers alone, that they would fight with intelligence and courage, and that they would win not because victory was certain, but because surrender was unthinkable. 79 years later, Bastogne remains the ultimate case study in defensive warfare. Military academies worldwide analyze the battle, not for its tactics alone, but for what it reveals about the relationship between leadership, determination, and battlefield outcomes. The Germans came to Bastogne expecting an easy victory, a quick seizure of a lightly defended crossroads town. Instead, they found 18,000 Americans who redefined what was possible in defensive combat. They came with overwhelming force. They left with a shattered offensive, tens of thousands of casualties, and the knowledge that numerical superiority means nothing when facing soldiers who simply refuse to be defeated. The paratroopers at Bastogne didn't just hold a town. They demonstrated that in warfare, as in life, outcomes are determined not by odds, but by the refusal to accept the supposedly inevitable. When the final accounting was done, Bastogne had held. The German offensive had failed. And military history had a new answer to an old question. What happens when an unstoppable force meets an unmovable object? At Bastogne, the unmovable object won. And it did so with a single word. Nuts.